The scent of damp earth and pine filled the air as David Anderson moved through the dense underbrush, his rifle resting comfortably against his shoulder. The hunt had been uneventful so far, and that suited him just fine. He was no longer the man he once was, no longer a soldier, no longer the sniper whispered about in war rooms across the stars. Out here he was just a father, a husband, a man who had traded war for the quiet life. He adjusted the strap of his pack and exhaled slowly, savoring the peace. Then the sky darkened. A deep, reverberating hum rolled over the forest, like the growl of some ancient beast. Birds burst from the canopy, scattering in a frenzy. David's instincts kicked in before his thoughts could catch up. His fingers tightened around the rifle, muscles coiling in readiness. He turned toward the clearing that led back to the settlement, his heart hammering against his ribs. A shadow passed overhead, vast, ominous, unnatural. He barely caught a glimpse through the trees, but what he saw was impossible to mistake. A Ganzari warship. David ran. His boots pounded against the forest floor, branches snapping as he tore through the undergrowth. His breath came in sharp bursts, but he didn't slow. He knew what this was. The Ganzari didn't take prisoners. By the time he reached the tree line overlooking the settlement, the destruction had already begun. The village was ablaze, columns of fire and smoke stretching into the sky like dying screams. Homes he had helped build, the very foundations of the life he had tried to carve for himself, were nothing but splintered wood and molten debris. The air shimmered with heat, the acrid scent of burning flesh cutting through everything. He swallowed against the bile rising in his throat. Then he saw them, Ganzari warriors, hulking reptilian figures clad in segmented armor, their blackened rifles spitting blue fire, moved through the settlement like executioners. They fired without hesitation, without mercy, cutting down men, women, and children as they fled. Bodies lay twisted in the dirt, their lifeless eyes reflecting the flames. David's pulse roared in his ears, but his mind remained cold, calculating. He shouldered his rifle, his scope snapping up as he scanned for his family. He found them near the central courtyard. James clung to his mother, his small frame trembling, but his eyes, his father's eyes, were fierce with defiance. His mother held him close, her lips moving as she whispered something to him. David forced himself to stay focused. If he fired now, he could take down 3, maybe 4 of the Ganzari before they pinpointed his position. But there were too many. Then, from the largest ship in the clearing, a towering figure emerged. Lord Viezur. David had never seen the warlord in person, but he had read the reports. Ganzari royalty, a strategist whose cruelty was matched only by his battlefield cunning. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, his emerald-scaled body adorned with armor fashioned from the bones of fallen enemies. His slit-pupiled eyes swept over the devastation with a sick sense of satisfaction. David's stomach twisted. He knew how this would end. Viezur motioned with one clawed hand, and the warriors dragged David's wife and son forward. She fought them, clawing, kicking, but the aliens were too strong. James struggled, his face red with fury, but he was only a child. A single blaster shot rang out. His wife crumpled. David didn't hear himself scream, didn't feel the recoil as he pulled the trigger. The Ganzari nearest to Viezur's right collapsed, a smoking hole where its skull had been. The second shot was already lined up before the first body hit the ground. The third, the fourth. He didn't stop. He didn't breathe. But it wasn't enough. James. Viezur turned toward the boy and muttered something in his guttural tongue. A warrior raised his rifle. David's scream tore from his throat as the shot fired. James fell. David's world shattered. His grip slackened, the rifle sliding from his hands. For the first time in his life, he felt truly helpless. The Ganzari had won. Something inside him splintered, twisted, reformed into something else. Something colder. He didn't notice the warriors descending upon him until it was too late. They struck hard, knocking the air from his lungs, metal-plated fists slamming into his ribs. The world spun. The taste of blood filled his mouth. He barely registered the impact of his body hitting the ground before darkness took him. By the time he woke, the warships were gone. The settlement was silent. The bodies remained. The smell of death hung in the air like a curse, a final insult from the monsters that had taken everything from him. David forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain lancing through his ribs. His fingers curled into fists, his nails biting into his palms. The man he had been, the husband, the father, was gone. In his place stood something far deadlier. He turned toward the horizon, eyes cold, breath steady. He would find them, and he would make them suffer. The night was silent, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the shattered remains of what had once been his home. David Anderson knelt beside the graves he had carved into the scorched earth, his fingers tightening around the hilt of the combat knife strapped to his thigh. The names of his wife and son were etched into his memory with a permanence deeper than stone. He had buried them himself, his hands raw, his mind a cold void where grief and rage swirled in an unholy fusion. The weight of their absence crushed him, but he did not break. He would not break. There was still work to be done. A man might have mourned. A soldier would have reported the attack and waited for orders. But David Anderson was neither anymore. The Galactic Empire had taken everything from him, and they had left him alive to remember it. That was their mistake. He was a man who had once dictated the flow of battles from behind a sniper's scope, a tactician whose very name had been a warning whispered through enemy ranks. He had walked away from war, but war had not walked away from him. Now, it had come knocking, and he would answer with fire and blood. He moved through the ruins of the colony, scavenging what little remained. Weapons, ammunition, survival gear, all remnants of the life he had once lived. He retrieved an old datapad from a shattered console, wiping the dust from its cracked screen. He needed information. The Gonzari had taken his brother, Mason, and that meant they had plans beyond mere slaughter. Mason had been a military engineer, one of the best. If they had kept him alive, it was for a reason, and David intended to find out why. The Empire's forces would have moved quickly, disappearing into the stars with their prize, but there were always those who knew how to find the trail of ghosts. He needed people, those who lived in the shadows, the kind who traded in blood and secrets. And he knew exactly where to start. It took him 3 days to reach the nearest hub of criminal activity, a smuggler's den nestled in the remains of an asteroid colony known as Black Hollow. The station was a hive of scum, a place where morality was a commodity and survival was a transaction. He moved through the dimly lit corridors with the ease of a predator in familiar territory. At the far end of a bustling tavern, a figure leaned against the bar, his boots propped up on the table as he toyed with a vibroblade between callous fingers. Damian Cole had once been a demolitions expert in the Earth Resistance Forces, a man who had turned his talents to less noble pursuits after the war. His dark eyes flicked up as David approached, recognition flashing across his face. "How?" Damian muttered, sitting up straight. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again. Thought you were playing family man on some backwater colony." David said nothing. Damian studied him for a moment before exhaling. "Yeah, thought so." He motioned toward a chair. "Sit. Tell me who needs killing." By the end of the night, David had assembled his team. Ryan Graves, a cyber warfare specialist, who had made a career out of breaking into Imperial databases and selling classified information to the highest bidder. Leon Mercer, a former space marine built like a walking tank, his heavy arms covered in old scars from wars long past. Zane Carter, a smuggler with more debts than friends, but one of the best pilots outside of the Empire's military. They had all fought beside him once, back when Earth had been on the brink of extinction. And they all owed him in one way or another. The moment he told them who had taken Mason, who had burned his family alive, There was no hesitation. The Galactic Empire had made enemies of men who had nothing left to lose. It started with intelligence. David needed to know where they had taken his brother, and for that, they had to make someone talk. Black Hollow was full of informants, but most wouldn't sell out the Empire without incentive. They found their answer in a Ganzari slaver named Orek Navir, a low-level enforcer with a taste for cruelty and a long list of enemies. It took little effort to corner him in the underbelly of the station, even less effort to convince him to talk. David's knife had a way of loosening tongues. Outpost Zorvith, a heavily fortified Imperial research station orbiting a barren moon in the Deltavir system. That was where Mason was being held, deep within the bowels of a facility designed to extract information in the most painful of ways. The Ganzari didn't waste resources on mere prisoners. Mason was important to them. David intended to make sure they regretted that decision. They moved fast, stealing a small freighter from the docks under the cover of darkness. Zane handled the piloting, skimming the edges of Imperial space as they charted a course toward the outpost. David spent the journey in silence, his mind calculating every variable, every potential weakness in the enemy's defenses. There was no room for error. As the station loomed in the viewport, its metallic structure bristling with automated turrets and defense drones, the weight of what they were about to do settled over them. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution, and David was the executioner. They breached the outer defenses with precision, disabling the perimeter alarms before the station could react. Leon led the charge, his heavy repeater cutting through enemy patrols like a blade through cloth. Ryan jammed their communications, ensuring that no distress signal would leave the outpost. Damien planted explosives along the structural weak points, his movements methodical, practiced. David moved through the halls like a ghost, his sniper rifle an extension of his will. The Ganzari were strong, but they bled like anything else. They died screaming, their scaled bodies crumpling under the weight of their own arrogance. They found Mason in the lower levels, shackled to an interrogation chair, his face bruised, his breathing shallow. He looked up as they entered, and despite the pain, despite the horrors he had endured, he still managed to smirk. "Took you long enough." David cut him free, gripping his brother's arm as he hauled him to his feet. There was no time for words, no time for anything but survival. The facility was already collapsing around them, fire and smoke choking the corridors as the explosives detonated in a chain reaction. They reached the docking bay just as the alarms screamed their final warning. Zane pulled them out of the blast radius, the station vanishing into the void behind them in a brilliant eruption of light and debris. The mission was over, but for David, this was only the beginning. The Galactic Empire had taken his family. Now, he would take everything from them. The cold void of space stretched infinitely beyond the bridge of the stolen Imperial Corvette, stars flickering like distant ghosts. David Anderson stood with his arms crossed, his gaze locked onto the holographic display hovering above the console. The Ganzari fleet movements traced patterns across the projection, red markers indicating high-priority military installations. The Galactic Empire had no idea what was coming. Mason sat at the navigation panel, his fingers moving across the interface with practiced ease despite the bruises that still marred his face. He was quiet, focused, but there was a weight in his expression that hadn't been there before. David saw it. The same cold hunger for justice, the same fire that had burned away his own grief. They had lost too much. There was no turning back now. The others moved around the ship, preparing for what came next. Damien was in the armory, humming a low tune as he modified the explosive payloads. Ryan worked through firewalls and encryption layers, siphoning classified data from the Corvette's internal systems. Leon methodically checked his weaponry, his every movement deliberate, controlled. Zane sat in the cockpit, feet propped up, but David knew his mind was running scenarios, planning escape routes they would likely never take. Their next target was a listening post deep within Imperial-controlled space. It wasn't heavily guarded, but it held critical intelligence, fleet supply lines, battle plans, weaknesses in the Empire's infrastructure. If they could take it, they could disrupt everything. They could make them bleed. The approach was silent. The corvette's transponder codes still valid enough to fool the station's automated defenses. They docked without resistance. The hangar bay eerily empty. David led the way, his rifle raised, senses sharp. They moved like shadows through the corridors. The hum of the ship's life support systems, the only sound beyond their own measured steps. The first Gonzari patrol never saw them coming. David's knife slipped between armor plates, silencing the alien before it could even choke out a warning. Damien planted charges along the corridor junctions, ensuring that no reinforcements would be coming from the lower decks. Ryan hacked into the central database, his fingers flying across the terminal. "We're in," Ryan muttered. "They've got fleet schedules, movement logs, resource allocations." He stopped, his expression darkening. "And something else. A project. Code name, Thanatos." David frowned. "What is it?" Ryan's brow furrowed as he scrolled through the data. "It's a weapon. A biological one." His voice was tight. "Designed to target human DNA exclusively. If they deploy this, every colony, every outpost, hell, Earth itself, would be wiped out in a matter of weeks." A chill settled over them. The Gonzari weren't just fighting a war. They were planning genocide. Leon exhaled sharply. "We have to destroy this." David nodded. "Where is it?" Ryan tapped the console. "High orbit over Veldros Prime. An Imperial research station. The core of their biological warfare division." He met David's gaze. "It's heavily fortified. More than anything we've hit before. That's never stopped us." David's voice was calm, but the rage beneath it simmered. "Set the charges. Wipe every file, every trace of this place." They left the station in flames, explosions ripping through its structure as they disengaged from the docking clamps. The fireball bloomed behind them, an inferno consuming data, lives, and every trace of what had transpired there. David watched it burn, the reflection of destruction flickering in his eyes. There was no turning back now. The journey to Veldros Prime was quiet. Tension hung in the air like an unspoken promise. They were heading into the heart of the enemy's stronghold, and they all knew the odds. No one spoke of survival. No one needed to. Mason studied the schematics of the research station, his jaw clenched. "We can't take it head-on. Not with the fleet presence in orbit." David nodded. "We won't. We go in silent. Plant the detonations at key structural points and cripple the station from within." Zane scoffed. "You make it sound easy." David met his gaze. "Nothing worth doing ever is." They infiltrated the station under the cover of darkness, slipping past security checkpoints and automated turrets. David moved with the precision of a man who had spent his life hunting in the shadows. The air inside the facility was sterile, the hallways too clean, too controlled. It felt wrong. Then they found the laboratories. Rows of containment units lined the walls, each holding a human test subject in stasis. Some were still alive. Most were not. The bodies bore the signs of genetic degradation, flesh withering, veins blackened, their very DNA unraveling before their frozen eyes. Mason's hands trembled. They were testing it. His voice was hollow. David swallowed the bile rising in his throat. This was no war. This was extermination. Leon's grip tightened around his rifle. "We kill every last one of these bastards." David nodded. They moved through the facility with the efficiency of men who had nothing left but vengeance. Security forces fell before they even knew they were under attack. Damien's charges were set along the station's primary support beams. Ryan hacked into the station's mainframe, disabling the emergency evacuation protocols. Then the alarms blared. David turned, already aiming before he even saw the figure emerging from the far corridor. Lord Viazur. The warlord stood at the threshold, his emerald eyes narrowing in recognition. I should have known, Viazur mused, his voice a guttural rasp. The human who refuses to die. David didn't waste time with words. His rifle snapped up, but Viazur was faster, lunging with the speed of a predator. David barely sidestepped in time, the warlord's blade slicing through the air where his head had been moments before. The others engaged the Ganzari forces flooding into the lab, gunfire and explosions shaking the station. David had no time to worry about them. Viazur was relentless, his strength monstrous, his strikes precise. David dodged, countered, his knife flashing as he aimed for weak points in the alien's armor. Viazur snarled as steel bit into flesh, but he didn't slow. He struck David hard, sending him crashing against the control panel. You have taken much from me, the warlord growled, advancing. But you are only a man. David wiped blood from his mouth. His grip on his knife tightened. And you're just another dead thing. He moved before Viazur could react. One fluid motion, one perfect strike. The knife drove deep into the warlord's throat, severing muscle and sinew. Viazur choked, his body convulsing. David twisted the blade, his voice cold. That was for my family. He ripped the knife free, and Viazur fell. The station shuddered as the detonations triggered, fire and destruction ripping through its core. David turned toward his team. It's done, he said. They sprinted for the ship, the station collapsing around them. The moment they cleared the blast radius, Zane engaged the jump drive, the wreckage of the facility vanishing behind them. They sat in silence. Mason exhaled, his shoulders sagging. We stopped it. David stared at the empty void beyond the viewport. No, he murmured. We started something. The void outside the viewport was endless, but the silence inside the ship was heavier than space itself. David Anderson stood with his hands braced against the console, his gaze locked on the tactical readout. The Ganzari research station was gone, reduced to little more than drifting debris, but the war was far from over. The Galactic Empire had seen the explosion. They had felt the wound. Now they would come. Ryan's fingers danced across the controls, rerouting encrypted transmissions, scanning for incoming threats. His jaw was tight, his usual easy arrogance buried under the weight of what they had just done. Mason sat beside him, reviewing the fragmented intelligence they had pulled from the station's mainframe before its destruction. His face was set in grim determination, his bruises dark against his pale skin. They know we're out here, Mason murmured. We barely have time to move before they mobilize. David nodded. He had expected this. The Galactic Empire was not a beast to be wounded and left to crawl away. It was a machine, a relentless entity that consumed everything in its path. But now it was bleeding. And when something bled, it could die. Zane swung his chair around from the pilot seat, his usual smirk absent. I did some scouting while you were busy tearing apart that lab. There's a fleet regrouping near the Ancaris Rift. Not just any fleet. The Imperial flagship is there. David's eyes narrowed. Viazur's command vessel? Zane nodded. The Tyrannies. The heart of the war machine. Leon leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed over his massive frame. You thinking what I think you're thinking? David met his gaze. We cut off the head. No one spoke for a moment. Then Damien let out a low whistle. Bold move even for you? He leaned forward, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw. But yeah, I like it. Ryan exhaled sharply. You know that ship is a fortress, right? We're talking about the most advanced war vessel in the entire Ganzari fleet. Heavily armed, layers of security, thousands of troops. David's expression didn't change. Then we don't attack it like an army. We take it like ghosts. The plan formed in silence, a thing of ruthless efficiency. They had spent years waging war in the shadows, moving unseen, striking before the enemy even realized they were there. Now, they would do the impossible. They would take down the Empire's flagship from within. The Tyrannies loomed in the distance, a behemoth of steel and firepower. David watched its massive form through the viewport as their stolen corvette drifted closer, its transponder codes freshly forged by Ryan's expert hands. The Imperial fleet allowed them entry, without hesitation, assuming them to be one of their own. They landed in a secondary hangar bay, their ship swallowed by the monolithic structure. David moved first, his team following in perfect silence. They moved like predators, their weapons ready, their focus absolute. The first guards fell without a sound, their bodies dragged into the shadows before the alarms could be tripped. They spread through the lower decks, planting charges at key junctions, critical power relays, ammunition stores, control hubs. This wasn't just an attack. It was a surgical dissection of the enemy's greatest weapon. David led the way toward the command center, his rifle firm in his grip. Every step was precise, calculated. The corridors were wide, metallic, polished to reflect the cold sterility of the Empire itself. But the deeper they moved, the more the tension coiled. They were nearing the heart of the beast. The doors to the central bridge loomed ahead, flanked by elite Gonzari guards. David signaled with a single motion. Leon struck first, his heavy repeater roaring as he took down the closest enemy in a single burst. Damien's grenades followed, the concussive blasts sending bodies flying. Ryan overrode the security locks in seconds, the doors sliding open to reveal the massive control chamber beyond. And there at the heart of it all stood the new warlord of the Gonzari Empire. Viazur's second-in-command, High Lord Drekes, turned toward them with cold amusement. His scales were obsidian black, his eyes burning like twin embers. "You overreach, human," Drekes rasped. "You believe yourselves predators, but you are only vermin who have slipped into the nest of gods." David raised his rifle. "Then let's see how easily gods bleed." Drekes lunged. David barely sidestepped in time, the alien's blade slicing the air where his throat had been. He countered with brutal precision, his knife flashing as he aimed for the warlord's exposed throat. But Drekes was faster than Viazur had been, more practiced, more refined. Their blades met in a clash of steel and fire, the sounds of battle raging behind them as his team fought off the remaining elite guard. Drekes struck hard, his strength monstrous, but David had fought too many wars to be overwhelmed. He used speed, used angles, dodged where it mattered, and struck where it counted. The warlord snarled, feinting left before slamming a gauntlet fist into David's ribs. Pain exploded through him, but he absorbed it, twisted with the momentum, and drove his knee into Drekes' gut. The alien staggered back for half a second. It was all he needed. David moved without thought, his knife slicing upward in a single fluid arc. The blade tore through Drekes' exposed throat, cutting deep. The warlord's eyes widened, a guttural choke escaping him. Blood, thick and dark, spilled down his armor as he stumbled. David grabbed him by the shoulder, pulling him close. "That was for my son." He shoved the blade deeper, then yanked it free. Drekes collapsed, his body convulsing before finally going still. Behind him, the battle had ended. His team stood among the fallen, bloodied but victorious. Mason stared at the corpse of the warlord, his expression unreadable. The ship shuddered beneath them, alarms blaring. The fleet had realized what was happening. It was time to leave. They sprinted back through the corridors, the detonations they had planted earlier already beginning to trigger. Explosions rocked the structure, flames licking at the walls as the flagship started to break apart. Zane had the ship ready the moment they reached the hangar. They launched into the chaos, weaving through the wreckage of the crumbling warship. The fleet scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The Tyrannies was dying, its systems failing, its command lost. David watched through the viewport as the behemoth ruptured from the inside, a chain reaction tearing through its core. It detonated in a burst of fire and destruction, its remains scattering across the void like ashes in the wind. Silence filled the ship. Then Damien let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Hell of a way to go. Mason exhaled slowly. It's done? David watched the dying embers of the Empire's greatest weapon fade into nothing. His hands, steady as ever, finally relaxed at his sides. No, he said. This is just the beginning.